Here's what I'm going to cover today. I'm going to do a super quick review of risk analysis theory, and please keep in mind that this was put together for the BCIT EHO students, so you may know a lot of this already. But if you uh, did catch that lecture on Monday, I have added a couple of new slides, so hopefully it'll still be interesting. Then I'll tell you practically what we do to assess food questions that we get from the field. So these questions are from EHOs, and then I'm going to run through these 5 case studies. The first 4 for sure, and if there's time, we'll do the 5th as well. So what is risk analysis? You've probably already seen this Venn diagram from the FAO. Risk analysis is defined as 3 broad areas: risk assessment, risk management, and risk communication. So most of the time today we're going to spend on risk assessment of food. So what does risk management mean to most inspectors and to us here? It could be any number of the activities that are shown on this slide. It could be ordering the destruction of product, or just reviewing documentations or doing an on-site inspection. We sometimes get involved in doing public advisories or recall notices, so I'm going to show you a little bit more about what we do here in a second. In terms of risk communications, it could be, in my opinion anyways, something as simple as giving a lecture. So today I'm communicating risk to you through the format of a lecture. One of the main things that we do is to inform our stakeholders about the outcome of an issue, and that can take many, many different forms. And our stakeholders are consumers, the industry, and regulators. It could just be having a meeting or a telephone call, could be an email or a tweet. Not from Lorraine, because I don't know how to tweet, or it could be educating your operator. Some of the other things we do is develop website messaging, and occasionally we'll suggest policy to our Ministry of Health. One of my favorite things to do is to write a peer-reviewed paper and attend a conference. But the other things we're asked to do here are INs or PSAs, and I'm not sure how your organization defines those, but for that, an issue note to management to give them a heads up about something, and a PSA for us is a public service advisory, and those often get posted onto our website. So I grabbed a couple of slides from our recall manual, and this is an overview of how we would approach a food recall, and I just put this in here for your interest. It's not really related too much to these food risk assessments I'm doing, but if you have a health risk event, so you have someone phone in with a complaint, or you have a suspect illness, or perhaps you have an adverse inspection finding, one of the first things you have to do in the risk communication area is give a heads up messaging. And then you enter into the risk assessment phase. So risk assessment can be for any number of activities. I'm going to talk about food assessment here. But in terms of a recall, you want to figure out if it's a low, medium, or high priority. And then here we're talking about the communications that you're going to apply depending on how serious it is, and then some of the follow-up actions you might have, which might be very minimal if it's low priority. You might just follow up with the consumer about the complaint. In terms of the actual communication, this is just, again, FYI, this is how we approach risk communication here at Food Protection. We will give a heads up communication, and then again enter the risk assessment phase, gather some evidence, and depending on the low, moderate, or high risk here, we'll escalate who we communicate to. So I just wanted to provide you some sort of framework for how risk assessment and risk communication can look, as well as risk management activities. So now let's talk about food risk assessment. Risk assessment considerations with food can be defined in 4 basic broad categories. First, you need to collect some background information about the food, examine the food properties, examine the food preparation, and then finally you evaluate the evidence and make recommendations. So when we start collecting background information on the food question that we get presented to us, the first thing we consider is there any history of foodborne illness with this food in the past? And many times you'll already know. So if there's any product that contains eggs, the first thing you think about is Salmonella enteritidis. But sometimes we encounter other foods where we don't really know the answer. Following that, you can review the literature and see what's available on that specific topic. You can look at the standards for preparation of the food, especially legislated guidelines. For instance, we look at the FDA food code all the time. You can see if there's lab testing criteria for that particular food commodity. You also want to consider if it's a new food or a common food. And then, of course, we always look into our archives to see if we've given advice on this in the past. And this last one is quite important. What do your colleagues know? It's always a good idea to ask the people that you work with, or even if you find a peer-reviewed paper on the subject, you can email the author and they can provide you with a lot of really good advice. So when we're looking at the food properties, the first thing we want to consider is all of the food ingredients in that food. Are they from an approved source? You want to review the 3 categories of hazards. So what are those 3 categories? If you were my BCIT student, someone would have put up their hand. And I'm getting lots of blank faces here. Okay, they're the biological, chemical, and physical hazards. So those are the 3 categories of hazards in food that you need to consider. So are there any PHF ingredients? And we look at intrinsic and extrinsic factors in those foods. So the intrinsic ones are the pH and water activity, that's AW, or whether the food naturally contains any antimicrobials. And then also extrinsic, I can never say that word, but those factors are important too. And that has to do with the storage temperature and the kind of packaging. Maybe it's in reduced oxygen packaging. And you also want to look at the shelf life. So in the food preparation, that's an area you guys are all really familiar with. You want to look at the critical control points in the process and the critical limits and find out if the food is processed to provide a proper pathogen reduction. And as well, not only just looking at that, you want to look at each food preparation process or each step in the process to make sure they're not doing things incorrectly that may contribute to increasing the risk of that food preparation. So finally, we get to the last stage where we're evaluating all the evidence we've collected and we've made recommendations. So the first thing that we always consider is, are there enough hurdles? I have a slide on that in a second. But when we talk about hurdles, we're talking about the pH, we're talking about the intrinsic and extrinsic factors, as well as the preparation techniques and things like that. So for instance, if a food requires more than temperature control, it may also have to be acidified. So that would be 2 hurdles in that food. And then you may have lab evidence, or you may recommend that they collect lab evidence. So what are the counts over storage time, or what is the pH of that food? And finally, you want to make sure you have enough information from the person who requested it to make an informed recommendation. So sometimes you do need to go back and get a bit more information from the person who made the initial request. Okay, so this slide is a bit blurry, but it's from the FAO site, and I just like the conceptual picture here where it's the food composition, acidity, water activity, and so on. So if you start adding all these things up, there's more and more hurdles that will prevent the microbes on the left-hand side of your screen there from growing. Okay, so how practically do we approach food risk assessment in environmental health? Well, the easy thing to do is to do a Google search, or perhaps look on Google Scholar. And you know, we wiki all the time. We're just like you guys. We go to Google and enter something in and see what pops up. A little bit harder is to do a proper database search of OVID or PubMed. We use that when we're checking for illnesses. And in that case, we define our search criteria and the number of hits that we get. So it's not truly a critical review, but it's something quick that we can do to inform ourselves. We'll look at specific books and journals that we know in the food area. So some of the books that we're always consulting are the ICMSF books, the International Commission or Criteria for the Microbiological Specificity of Foods. And later on, I have a reference to show you on that. We'll look at food journals and then authoritative government websites. And again, I can't stress enough, talk to your colleagues or email authors in the field. So that's the collecting information phase. So let's jump right into one of these 5 case studies that I'm hoping to present today. We get a lot of farmers market questions. This was a typical one, although it seemed pretty simple. Is there any information on the shelf stability for typical fresh and partially dried pasta products? So the inspector who asked had a vendor who wished to make pasta in their home and then sell it at a farmer's market. So how long are they allowed to store it in the refrigerator, or what kind of shelf life or best before date should there be? And I think we had troubles with this slide before, so I'm just going to press enter again. There we go. So what's in flour? The first thing is, what are the ingredients in flour? And just so you know, throughout this presentation at the top in the superscript, I'm going to give all of the references from all of these consultations we did, just so you know that we didn't make it up. Anyways, flour. It could be any number of flours: semolina, farina, wheat flour, water, and sometimes it contains eggs. So if it contains eggs, what's the principal hazard? It's a biological one. Yay! All right. Yes, Salmonella enteritidis is again our biggest issue. So the hazard in these ingredients are Salmonella and also Staphylococcus aureus if there's improper food handling, because it is a hands-on kind of food preparation technique, as well as you have issues with spoilage molds. And I mentioned that ICMSF book, and this is the one that we used for this. So it talks about the microbes that you'll find in different food commodities. So that's a good one to look at if you haven't seen it before. The first one here, the Extension Service, we get a lot of valuable information from different US sites. They have academic institutions where they specialize in certain areas, food safety areas. So if you're looking for a particular topic, if you Google Extension Service with that topic, you will actually come up with some really good information. So we have Salmonella, Staph aureus, and potential molds. Well, the next thing we need to figure out, or the criteria for pasta, is water activity. So fully dried pasta, that's the dry noodles that you get in boxes that can sit on your shelf for years. Their water activity is very low, 0.4 to 0.6, and they're considered shelf stable at room temperature. Fresh pasta, we were able to find some references on that. They are between 0.92 and 0.99, and usually you can only refrigerate them for 2 to 3 days, maybe a few days longer if you add preservatives. For partially dried pasta, however, we really couldn't find any reliable literature. And so when that happens, sometimes you end up checking blog sites to try and get an idea of what the practice is out in the field, but we wouldn't consider those very credible sources of information. So at this point, we're not able to fully answer this question for partially dried pasta. So what else did we find out? Oops, I hit the wrong button. Okay, I mentioned we couldn't find very much information. We did read in the literature that drying the pasta at room temperature was definitely a risk for the growth of those two microbes, Salmonella and Staph aureus, because it can form a heat-stable enterotoxin. We did learn that commercial pasta, the ones that's room temperature, shelf stable, they're usually dried at temperatures above 55 Celsius. So this is a temperature at which most bacteria won't grow. We also learned that moisture resorption is an issue in pasta that's only partially dried. So if it's dried in high humidity areas, you increase your potential spoilage with molds and growths of bacteria. And one interesting thing we did learn is that pH is actually not a very good indicator in this case of safety or shelf stability, because once coliforms, if they're present, start growing in the product, they'll release metabolites that actually drop the pH. So normally, for those on the line or in the room that don't know, our criteria for a non-PHF or non-potentially hazardous foods is a water activity of 0.85 or less and a pH of 4.6 or less. So in this case, pH doesn't help us. But water activity is more important than temperature for controlling the molds. As well, we learned that the CFI says the manufacturer must establish the shelf life. So based on this information, we evaluated this evidence, and these were the recommendations that we gave back to the health inspector. The first thing was the operator should really be testing their water activity. And if it was less than 0.6, it could reliably be stored at room temperature for several months. But if it was greater than 0.6, of course, it has to be stored in the refrigerator. And although we didn't have an actual definitive date we could give, we said it would probably be okay for about 1 week, as refrigeration stops the growth of molds and spoilage bacteria. And we did recommend that the operator tests their pasta at zero, after they make the pasta, and then 1 week later and 2 weeks later, to establish if there was an increase in aerobic colony counts as well as coliforms. We also recommended that instead of drying on the table at room temperature, that they put it in a low heat oven, that they use pasteurized eggs to control for salmonella, and as with most of our recommendations, that they have proper hygiene in place to control for Staph aureus. So that's a typical food risk assessment that we receive quite often. So let's go to the next one. So this question was, can raw food desserts be made with raw cocoa or raw carob for sale in farmers markets? I don't know if you guys get a lot of farmers market questions, but we get lots and lots. So this actually started with commercial chocolate, and we had 3 different requests related to chocolate over the course of about 6 or 7 months. It started with our temporary food market guideline, that's the TFM that you see at the bottom of each of those 3 squares. And it was to do with making desserts from commercial chocolate. Then we had the homemade carob raw chocolate dessert, and then the commercial carob raw chocolate dessert. So we had 3 different questions. So the first one had to do with the wording in our guidelines. So prior to 2014, in Appendix 1, which we call our low-risk foods, and they're allowed to be made at home for sale in public or in temporary food markets or farmers markets, we had listed that chocolate could be used in an ingredient in a food if it had undergone cooking to at least 71 Celsius. And I'll explain in a few minutes why that was bad advice that we gave. But so now we have chocolate, provided it is used for remelted or remolded products, and that it's not purchased from bulk bins, and that it's sourced from a manufacturer that can provide a COA. That is what we now allow for use. So why did we determine this was bad advice? Okay, first let's learn a little bit about how chocolate is made. So at the left-hand side of your screen in the darker blue area, the first 3 steps are for cocoa beans is what's performed in what they call the dirty area. So they take the beans, clean them, and then roast them. And if you look at all the other steps in the process, the only critical control point is that roasting step. So that means after that point in the process, any pathogens that are introduced cannot be further controlled. So it's really important that the beans are roasted. So as you can see, as you go further to the right, there's many, many other steps. So after they roast the beans, they cool them, they crush them a little bit, they grind them, they press them into cakes. Depending on what kind of chocolate they're making, they might add sweetened milk or different milk powders if they want milk chocolate versus dark chocolate. And there is very much an artisanal approach to making good quality chocolate. And conching, and there's a whole bunch of steps, but the critical one here is the roasting step. So let's look at some chocolate manufacturing facts, and I'll explain the chart on the right-hand side in a minute. The water activity in chocolate is super, super low. Look at that. It's even lower than that shelf-stable pasta, 0.37 to 0.5. I mean, that's really low. Again, I can't stress this enough. In most of the outbreaks, this is in the 3rd bullet, it's a failure to control the roasting step that causes all the salmonella outbreaks. Now, there was one study that was really interesting that talked about conching. So that was one of the later steps in the process. So this is actually a step where they take the almost finished chocolate and they're trying to heat it to remove certain crystals in the chocolate matrix so it's smooth and silky. But they found that the D value, and for those of you who don't know what that is, that's dropping the amount of pathogens by 1 log, so by a power of 10. So 1 D value took 1,292 minutes that's a whole day at 60 Celsius to drop, potentially if there's salmonella there, one log. So say from 100,000 to 10,000. There's no way that you can apply this in an industrial process. And in fact, if you lower the temperature by 10 degrees, it takes half the time. So when we were telling people, oh yeah, use that chocolate and heat it up to 71, we're actually increasing the resistance of the salmonella that's there if it's there. So that advice was poor, and we changed it. So on the right-hand side, this is anyone in the audience make chocolates at Christmas time or treats for people? I do. So when I was reviewing this evidence, I realized when you buy chocolate, you do what's called tempering. And this chart talks about tempering. And basically you heat, if you want your chocolate to have a nice gloss and not have that fuzzy white stuff grow on it, you want to temper it. And what that means is you take your block of chocolate, you heat it up just a little bit, only to like 40, I think it's like 47 Celsius. It's a very low temperature, and you let it cool almost to room temperature, heat it up a little bit more again, and then you're done. So by telling people to heat their chocolate up to 71 Celsius to make a molded chocolate, they would scorch it. So intuitively, we knew that this was bad advice. Okay, so let's go to our recommendations. Again, we want to get the chocolate sourced from a reputable supplier that can provide one of those certificates of assurance. Make sure that people making these chocolates at home aren't buying the chocolate from bulk food bins. We often say this because we're never certain in the store who else has touched that bin or if there's other contaminants on the bin. We want the operators to be educated about the risks and tell them to have hygienic control. We also recommended that the melted and remolded chocolate shouldn't be, if they have to unmold it and they want to rework it again, that means there's been some significant handling, and that we would prefer that then that chocolate only be used in baked products. And we reworded the guidelines as you already saw. So back to the original question, how about raw food desserts made with raw cocoa or carob? Okay, well, carob, I didn't know anything about carob. So I did the first thing most of us would do. I wikied it and found a picture. And I found out that carob is a chocolate substitute. It's low in caffeine and theobromine, and that's why it's considered healthy. And it's also made from beans, and these are actually called locust beans. And they can also be used as a food gum. The food process is generally the same as for chocolate. You wash the pods, de-seed them, roast them, and then mill into powder. And what else did we find out about carob? I could find no evidence for outbreaks or illnesses, and also no Canadian recalls for carob on the CFI website. There was a recall for carob on the US website, but principally it was for allergens. We also found from the literature that when you roast those locust beans or roast the carob pods, that it drops the pH of the pods from 6 to 4.8, which that's actually a good thing. And then in terms of hazards, since there wasn't anything in the literature about carob, we had to infer from cocoa beans. There's the typical physical hazards. So once you de-seed the pods, you may have stones or bits of the pod or bits of metals potentially with those before you grind them. Chemical issues were aflatoxins and mycotoxins. And again, although neither carob nor cocoa is an allergen, depending on where they're sourcing their product, there is a potential allergen risk if it gets mixed in with some other kind of tree nut. So some operations do more than one thing. So there's always that risk if they don't separate the process. And then the biological risks, and again, principally Salmonella, Verotoxigenic E. coli, and even one with a fermented carob product that had Bacillus cereus in it. Okay, so knowing a little bit about the hazards, we can look closer at the process for carob powder. This is from a blog site. The flow chart I put together myself based on how they tell you to process and prepare carob. I think this was a California site. And I like to prepare food flowcharts because it makes it really easy for me to understand all the different steps and where the critical control point is. So very similar to, again, processing of cocoa. You wash and boil the carob pods. This is what was recommended on this blog site. And this will help clean off any outer debris. You split the pod with the knife, deseed it, dehydrate and grind the pods, dry in oven at low temperature in a dehydrator. And the site didn't give a temperature, but this would be considered the critical control point. Blend, sift to remove any other physical hazards like the stones and things that we talked about. And then the powder is ready to use to make carob chocolate. Okay, so what are the recommendations for home prepared raw carob? Well, basically, we didn't think it was a good idea. So when I say raw carob, this person was proposing that they would collect carob pods from a tree, de-seed them, take the beans, grind them, and use them without any roasting step or cleaning step. So we decided just to flat out say, no, we do not recommend using home prepared raw carob powder without any roasting or heating step in the process. Because, and the rationale for that was based on the evidence we collected. I couldn't find very much information on how carob should be processed other than that website, but we know a lot about chocolate foodborne illnesses, so that's what we recommended. So if they chose to add a roasting or heating step in the process, we would agree. But then they should also have a hygienic process and sift the powder for physical hazards and take a look at those carob pods and make sure that they're inspected for molds. So that was the raw carob advice that we provided. So then the next question that the EHO got from that same vendor, so they always come back with another question, you guys all know that, is like, well, can I make my raw food desserts if I buy raw carob powder that was purchased commercially? So I spent a bit of time looking around on the internet, and I did actually find a couple of commercial vendors for carob where they did actually provide a certificate of analysis. So I know it doesn't show up very well on your screen, but about halfway down you can see that they have actually looked at the total plate count, the molds, the E. coli, and the salmonella. So at least it's something. I mean, not finding anything doesn't mean that there isn't a problem in the food, but at least there's some degree of assurance. When we contacted Sun Foods, they did say that the carob pod is air dried for no more than a few seconds. And in fact, they source this product from Italy. So they're just the supplier. But this was the best evidence we could get. But if you really like to eat raw food and you can only use raw organic carob powder, then we felt that perhaps this would be an acceptable route to go. So what did we recommend? We were clear in our recommendations that raw carob or cocoa purchased from a commercial supplier may still be higher risk than traditionally manufactured cocoa or carob that has a heating step, but it would be acceptable for use in the raw food products for that ingredient, if they had a certificate of analysis, and if the foods that were prepared still had a pH below 4.6 or a water activity below 0.85. We also said that the preparation of the foods with raw carob and cocoa must be done with processes that minimize any upstream amplification of existing hazards, such as salmonella. Has to be sanitary and hygienic. And that we would further recommend consumer disclosure, because I think when people are eating or when they're purchasing these products, they might not necessarily be aware that it's a raw food product, and depending on who's purchasing it, we would recommend consumer disclosure. Now, I don't think that's common practice, but it is one of our recommendations. And we also thought that for liability concerns, the market manager who's allowing the vendor to sell these products should also be aware that they're raw food. And they have to often review the recipes here, so hopefully they're aware of that. So this brings up the whole issue around raw foods, those of you that have encountered this. And we just, for raw food applications, we've kind of got a list in our head now of the things that we'll say back to people. Again, raw ingredients have to have a certificate of assurance. They shouldn't be purchased from bulk bins. We strongly recommend that people making these things provide the EHO or the market manager approving the recipes. They should chart out the food flow, provide a proper recipe, and have a food safety plan. And then the last one is the most important. I mentioned that the process step must be designed to limit amplification of potential hazards. Some of those steps are soaking dry ingredients in water at temperatures above 4 degrees C. So this would add to the risk in the process, so we would not recommend this. So if you have to soak your beans before making your raw bean cake, do it in the fridge, not at room temperature. If you're dehydrating your food mixtures, don't do it in the danger zone. And if you are doing a fermentation, make sure that you have proper anaerobic conditions so that you can have the lactic acid fermentation occur properly. So those are just some general guidelines. We were kind of hoping we'd write this up in a separate document, but it's on the to-do list. Okay, next one. Is it an unsanitary practice when bakeries do not wash their proofing linens? So I worked on this with Cy, and it was quite interesting. I had no idea that this practice occurred. To get a nice crust on the surface of breads, chefs will often put them in linens and let them proof there. So what did we know about proofing linens? Not very much. And there wasn't that much in the literature. So another name, common name for this, or the most common name, rather than bakery linen, is baker's couche. And when I presented this on Monday, Helen told me that couche means to sleep or to lie your head on a pillow or something like that in French. No, she said it. I thought the bread was nestled on a pillow, not in a diaper. Someone from the audience said couche means diaper. Anyways, okay, well, my mental image is now worsened. Okay, so anyways, this product, as I mentioned, allows a crust to form on the bread. And there's actually two types of bakery couches, flax linen and cotton canvas. And in the blog sites, because we couldn't find any peer-reviewed literature on this, but flax linens, all the chef blog sites said they shouldn't be washed because it changes the structure and performance of the linen, and then it gets all wrinkly and you just can't use it anymore. But the cotton canvas ones you could possibly wash and reuse if you ironed it and then floured it before use. So the green symbol here is what's the main hazard associated with bread. That I won't torture the audience anymore. We would consider this the couche as an ingredient or a utensil, but the principal hazard here is actually molds. So what else could we find out? Well, I love the internet. I found a bunch of pictures of bakery couche on the internet, and you know, I don't know how it looks on your screen, but it does look kind of dirty to me. So if I was an inspector and I ran across this, I think it was a really reasonable question that they had to bring it to our concern. But just like, you know, the way something looks, does it actually impart a true risk? It's just like you can't tell if your meat is done by touching it or looking at it. You have to put in a thermometer. So we did a bit more investigation. I have a few more pictures here. At the top, these are some couches that have been used for over 50 years, all rolled up. And on the right-hand side, these are the ones that are hanging up to dry at the end of the day. So, you know, visually it looks kind of nasty, but is there any real risk? So what else did we find out? Well, in fact, breads come in two basic types, lean dough and rich dough. And couches should only be used with lean dough. So if you use them with rich dough, with eggs and oil and butter and things, that's a no-no. So if you're inspecting these premises, figure out what kind of breads they're using them with. And if it's lean dough, it's pretty low risk. In terms of cleaning the actual couches, bakeries don't usually use wet cleaning methods because as soon as you mix water with flour, you get glue. So again, I just put some search criteria for PubMed here, but we could find absolutely no illnesses related to the use of baker's couche. There were plenty of illnesses when we did look for foodborne illness in bakery and bread, but they were pretty much all related to either food handler issues or eggs. So even though those couches look nasty, if they're used with lean dough and if they're properly scraped down and floured and dried, specifically dried at the end of each use, they're probably pretty safe. So that's what we gave in our recommendations, was that after each use they should be scraped down and dried. Discard if they're visibly moldy and a little bit dirty, it's not too bad. If they look really dirty and you can convince the operator to buy some new ones, terrific. But if they refuse, well, there really isn't a risk or hazard here. Although they're not reliable sources of information, I mean, you can really get a sense of the practices on blog sites. And in fact, even whether or not you can wash and reuse flax linen was being questioned on the blog site. So some blog sites said, oh, you can wash flax, it's easy, you just iron it while it's wet with a steaming hot iron. So you could recommend that to your operator as well. And the cotton canvas ones do need to be washed, floured, and ironed before use if they're dirty. Okay, here's my favorite subject. Seems like everything is sous vide these days. Since we got our sous vide guidelines out last September, we just keep getting more and more questions. And here's one that we got this year from Vancouver Coastal. I should say thank you to all the inspectors that submit these questions. So is the sous vide cook process for shell eggs used by a particular operator acceptable? And on the right hand side you can see a stainless steel bowl with some eggs that I got off the net, but this is important. So a backgrounder to this question, we actually had 2 Salmonella enteritidis illnesses linked to this premise. And these sous vide style cooked eggs were actually used as a glaze on some bakery products. So none of the eggs were tested. It's really hard to find salmonella in eggs. And we don't know for sure if it was the sous vide eggs that caused the illness, because he was also serving Caesar salad made with raw eggs as well. But anyways, it was important that we investigate this right away because it was linked to illnesses. So what's the hazard? Well, we know it's Salmonella enteritidis, but what else can I tell you about that? We did do a lit search on that. And what we know about Salmonella enteritidis is from a study done in 2005, we have about 6.3 billion table eggs sold. So I would say 7 billion table eggs are sold in Canada annually. And almost 2 million of them can be contaminated with Salmonella enteritidis. In the table there, this was from a study done in the US, and they were figuring out how they could reduce the annual number of Salmonella illnesses if they applied a log reduction or if they pasteurized the eggs. So without doing anything, you could have 130,000 illnesses, but if you reduce the Salmonella present in the eggs by 3 logs or 1,000, you would have 2.5 to 3 times less illnesses. So, you know, it's pretty simple. If you properly pasteurize your eggs, you're going to reduce the risk of Salmonella enteritidis illness. Salmonella enteritidis will get into the egg mostly from a vertical transmission from the hen. So the mother of the hen contaminates the interior of the egg, or various layers of the egg. It could be the egg whites, could be the egg yolk. And contamination sometimes gets in about 20% of the time from the environment. So knowing all this, oh yes, this slide is to remind me to give you a quick primer on sous vide if you've never heard of this before. This is another French term. It means under vacuum. These foods are packaged in reduced oxygen packaging, and LT means it's cooked for a low temperature for a longer time. So sometimes these foods are cooked in what we would consider just above the danger zone, or within the danger zone. We've seen recipes anywhere from 45 Celsius up to around 70 Celsius. The foods that are in the vacuum packaging are immersed in a water bath, which is called an immersion circulator, and they're cooked usually for longer periods of time. And the reason why it's preferred to have this cooking technique, there's several reasons, but one of them is that the foods won't overcook like they might do in a conventional oven. And also it's traditionally been used in catering services where they can prepare large batches of food and then just do a heat and serve for immediate service. Often the foods are depackaged and finished or grilled or seared, but we want to achieve, within sous vide cooking, we want to achieve our pathogen reduction while the food is immersed in the water. Okay, so how are the eggs made? Well, this is what the operator did. He put 60 eggs that were in the refrigerator into a stainless steel bowl, put the bowl into his immersion circulator, left them for 2 hours, and then he cooled them on a cookie sheet at room temperature. But that bowl wasn't perforated. That was probably the biggest issue. So the water really wasn't circulating around the eggs. And when the inspector actually checked the internal temperature of one sous vide egg, it was only at 55 Celsius. The egg yolk was yellow and really, really runny, and the egg white was only partly translucent. So I found some more pictures on the internet. At the bottom right, you can see what a properly cooked sous vide egg at 62 or 63 Celsius should look like. So the yolks might still be quite yellow and runny, but the whites are completely cooked. And on the top chart, although I don't have the y-axis here to tell the time, and I wasn't able to find it on the site, I think these are probably 10-minute intervals. So based on what the inspector was seeing, I suspect if there was any heat applied at all to the yolk or the white, it was probably only around 62 for 20 minutes. So it totally didn't achieve any pathogen reduction here. The egg should have looked more like this. Anyways, it basically didn't come up to temperature for long enough. Well, the first question we wanted to ask ourselves is, are the new sous vide guidelines flawed? Are we giving the correct advice? So the way we defined sous vide in our guidelines is the come up time plus the pathogen reduction time. And the pathogen reduction time in table 3 at 62 Celsius, you need to hold the egg for about 12.4 minutes. So I contacted Chef Edgar Rahal from our working group and asked him what's the standard practice for chefs when they sous vide eggs properly. And in fact, it is for 45 minutes. So it takes about 30 minutes for the water bath to equilibrate under proper conditions, and then another 15 minutes for the pathogen reduction time. So in fact, that's the right advice, and it's consistent with our guidelines. We also looked around, and I did find some studies on the net about how long the come-up time takes, and 30 minutes is standard in commercial pasteurization of eggs, so it all fits with our guidelines. So when we evaluated the evidence, you know, like I said before, the stainless steel bowl did not allow the water to circulate properly. There was no food safety plan that specified the come-up time or pathogen reduction, and the cooling time on the cookie sheet wasn't specified. So basically the eggs were probably temperature abused for 4 hours, and if there was salmonella there, it probably amplified enough that it would cause illness. And these are the recommendations. I'm looking at the clock thinking I have to talk faster. So just what I talked about before, the immersion circulator must perform adequately for the amount of food that's in there. If you're going to do eggs, use a perforated bowl and specify all of the processes. Okay, last one. Can a flax and sunflower oil product be sold in farmers markets? Another farmers market question. And on the right is this Petiba oil screw press, which in fact was what the operator planned to use. I don't know anything about manufacturing of oil, so you know, the first question is, what's the operator process? They wanted to soak the sunflower seeds in the refrigerator for 2 days, so that looked good. Put the sunflower and flax seeds into the extractor. Add a little water while they're screwing the press down and extracting it. Bottle it, refrigerate it, and they're going to give it a shelf life of 6 days. Does that sound safe? I don't know. So I looked up how you usually make oil. Oh! There's all kinds of ways to make oil, but it's a heavily, heavily processed thing. It's unbelievable, actually. You look at all of these different things. Some of them degum them, and they have caustic refining, or they bleach it, they filter it. There's all kinds of stuff they do. So what are the hazards? Again, I don't know. So I consulted the literature. I found out, you know, the plants that sunflower and flax oils are made from, and they're all rich in high linoleic acids, so they're very healthy oils for you to ingest. But there really wasn't much information about the hazards that would be in a crude extraction, because most of these are removed during that extensive processing. So what I could figure out was that there were possibility for physical hazards like dirt and seed casings that might be left over. Flaxseed oil does contain some chemicals that might be an issue and potential allergens. And then what I wasn't sure about was that you've got this anaerobic environment with water added. Could CBOT be an issue? I really wasn't sure. So what else did we find out about what's in a crude oil? They can contain other phosphatides and phospholipids, waxes, mucilaginous matter, which I don't really know what that is, but I didn't think it sounded very good. And other different resins, pherols, sterols, trace metals, things like that, a whole bunch of other things. And these would all normally be removed in a commercial extraction process. So evaluating that initial food flow chart, these were some of the things we thought that were a gap in their procedure. There was no washing or disinfecting step of the seeds. The seeds weren't heated or cooked before they were ground. Very important, there was no separation step to remove any of the surface water from the oil before they bottled it, and they didn't filter the oil to remove any particulates. So the recommendations that we gave is that the product was low risk but not zero risk. The seeds should be screened for dirt, sticks, and other stuff before using, and if they could possibly hull those sunflower seeds before putting them in the press extractor, that would be a good idea. And that they should at least grossly refine the oil by separating out the water. We also felt that they should have a statement on their bottle that said, keep refrigerated at all times. And just to be on the safe side, reduce the shelf life from 6 days to 4 days. So was that good advice or not? I wasn't sure, so I actually sent this to the Bureau of Microbial Hazards for an assessment, and their comments were kind of in line with ours. They said that, you know, most oils don't have an aqueous phase that would permit the growth of C. botulism, so as long as that's removed, it's a much safer product. And in fact, they felt that the refrigeration was not necessary from a safety perspective. So without knowing exactly what happened, I think our advice was generally okay. You can tell me what you think. Okay, that brings me to the end of my presentation and my very favorite of all time, food risk assessment. I also wanted to thank all the EHOs for all of their questions. We enjoy hearing what's actually going out in the field, and appreciate your feedback. So I'll take your questions now. I do have one kind of appeal to add at the end. I can go to that now. If you didn't see it, this is my favorite part. If it's bacon, you eat it. Okay, so I don't want to reinvent the wheel. I bet you across Canada there's lots of EHOs who have had questions the same as this, or maybe you have questions and answers that you could share with us. So let's do something cooler. And I'm really happy to say that NCCEH has agreed to put links of these documents, which we hope to post on our website. So I have about 18 to 20 consultations like the 4 that I've shown you here, including these 4. We're going to try and put them on our website in the next week, actually. And NCC has agreed to link over to them. And I was hoping that if you had those kinds of issues in your practice, if you could share the answers, then we don't have to reinvent the wheel. And this picture is to say that I showed you mine, so could you show me yours? Anyways, we'll go back to this. So I'm happy to take any questions from the audience. Or sure, yeah, great. So these deli meats, I'm always mindful of the listeria risk. I'm always worried about refrigerators that say they're holding at 4 Celsius, but really they're holding at 10 Celsius. And uh, honestly, I think probably some meats are well processed and fairly safe. It would depend on the food, but you know, I would say less than a week for sure, and 3 to 4 days would make me feel happier. I don't know. It's really hard to give a general kind of answer on that. So the question was, do we use pathogen modeling? Where we can, we do, but I have PMP on my computer, but I don't have admin rights. So every time I want to use it, I have to go into this special account, which is a pain. But when I do use it, it's very restrictive in the times and temperatures that it allows you to look at. So I actually tried to use it for my eggs issue, and it doesn't really work because it, it doesn't do sous vide temperatures. It's mainly what's the growth at 20 C or below. So it's not very, yeah. I haven't tried Combase. I could have a look at that, but we do try to use those, and if you have really good programs that you know of, let me know. Any other from the